Good morning and welcome to the Point. To say this was a busy week politically in Michigan would be an understatement. We saw Prop 1 go down in a big way, and just 2 days later, Governor Rick Snyder says he's not interested in the White House after all. 3 other people who were in Michigan this week. Ben Carson made it official in Detroit. Governor Scott Walker was in Novi. And on Monday, it was Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky who talked to us about why he's running.
Senator, you talked about a lot of things, but a lot of them involved the Constitution, freedoms of individuals, freedom in religion, in our personal matters, and you had particularly pointed words about spying, invasive, what you see as invasive policies of our government. On day one, what would you do to try to reverse those trends?
The bulk collection of all of our phone records was done by executive order. On day one, by executive order, I'd stop doing that. I don't think it's consistent with our Constitution. One of the things we fought the revolution about was to make sure that we had some privacy. And the Fourth Amendment says the government can look at your records, but they're supposed to have a judge sign a signature, it's supposed to have your name on the warrant, and it's supposed to say what it is they're looking for, and they're supposed to have probable cause, some kind of evidence that you've done something wrong. The bulk collection of all our phone records, most of us have done nothing wrong, and our name's not on the warrant. They just put the phone company on there and they collect all the records. So I think that's wrong, and I think most of the American people think so too.
I don't know how many of those running for president in the Republican Party will challenge you heavily on that, but somewhere will say along the line that, look, this is about security, this is about safety, this is about protection of the American people. You remember, as we all do, 9/11. So they will say this is really part and parcel of keeping America safe to them, you would say.
I think you can obey the Constitution and stop terrorists. For example, murder and rape are horrific crimes, but we still ask the police to call and get a warrant. So if there's someone in Grand Rapids that's committed a terrible crime, we think, there's some evidence that they live in a certain house, the police don't break the door down. What they do is they stand on the curb, even 3 in the morning, they call a judge. The reason we separated the judiciary from the police is so we have checks and balances, so it never gets out of hand, and so we try to not get into a problem where bias might enter into actions.
You spoke of something that I've rarely heard Republicans talk about, and that was this broad, inclusive view. Give me the example that you gave about coming over the hill singing. This idea that you, as a Republican leader, would like to make the Republican Party broader than what it is, because as you accurately point out, no Republican has won a presidential election in this state in a general since 1988, and there are other states out there, I think a dozen or more that you mentioned.
I think the Republican Party needs to be bigger, better, and bolder. So I talk about how we need to be the party of the entire Bill of Rights. Republicans are often very good at talking about the Second Amendment. I'm a big supporter of the Second Amendment. But we also need to be the party of the Fourth Amendment, which is the right to privacy, but also the party of the Fifth and Sixth Amendment. I think there are a lot of poor people in our country, and there's some unhappiness from poor people and a lot of African Americans, a lot of Hispanics, poor whites, who don't feel like the justice system is treating them fairly. And one of the examples I told is of a 16-year-old kid from the Bronx, arrested, kept in prison for 3 years without a trial. His bail was $3,000. Most wealthy families would have gotten their kid out within a night at the most in prison. But he had a horrific experience and tried to commit suicide 4 times, and that's un-American, and it's a violation of his constitutional rights, and someone needs to speak up for people like that, and I want to be that person.
You know a lot about the way this process works. You've seen it up close, and you know that it's always an uphill battle. There's all of the money you have to raise, all the time you have to submit. We were just talking, one of your challenges is to get back on a plane, to get back to do your day job,
right.
Which is being a United States Senator and a vote that you want to get to. How difficult was it for you to come to this decision, or to the part of the decision where we are now?
It took a while. My wife and I talked about it for probably a year, and it has to be sort of a family project in the sense that, you know, there's time away from family. There's the rigors of your family being run through the ringer as well. And so it wasn't an easy decision. But I've come to the conclusion that I don't believe there's any other possible candidate in the Republican Party that's going to broaden our message enough to be able to win the nomination anymore. We're an increasingly diverse country, and until the Republican Party becomes a party that has more African Americans, more Hispanics, more Jewish Americans, more people of all walks of life in it, more working class folks. Until that happens, we're not going to be able to win Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, these bigger states, and I want to be part of making that message big and broad enough and consistent with our values. I think our values are of individual liberty, but we haven't spread that message to enough people, I think, in an appropriate way. And I think if the message is cultivated and if you'll show up, I think there's a great possibility. You know, I've been to Detroit. I went to Detroit with economic freedom zones, dramatically lowering the taxes for Detroit to help them bail themselves out.
When you think of that message and think of traditionally how many of those groups that you've just outlined have voted for Democratic candidates, how do you make that change, particularly in what will seem like a long cycle, but we're only 18 months away from the election?
You know, when I visited Detroit or Chicago or Atlanta and met with minority leaders in those cities, to a person, they've been excited to see me. Every one of them said, we want someone to compete for our vote. The Democrats have taken us for granted. Our Democrat congressmen don't show up because they know we vote 95% for Democrats, so why should anybody compete for our vote? I'm taking the opposite approach. Republicans got 3% in Detroit. I want to get 20% in Detroit, 25% in Detroit. I want to eventually be able to win Detroit. I want eventually, in 1928, almost all African Americans were Republicans. I want to go back where there's equal competition between the parties and that every population, no matter where you come from, what your race is, knows that there are those in the Republican Party who want the law to treat everybody equally under the law.
We've got about 45 seconds left. One of the things that you will have to do in running for president is shed the image that one of your Republican colleagues likes to label you and Congressman Losh and others. I won't use it, but there are those people out there that wonder exactly what you would do as president, exactly how you would perform as president. I know it's a short period of time, and I hate to make you truncate the answer, but tell me what you would say to people who are looking at you for the first time as a candidate who may have questions.
I'm a Reagan Republican. I believe in a strong national defense. I think it's the most important thing the federal government does. When I look at spending, when I prioritize spending, it will be to defend the country. I also believe in peace through strength, and that's what Reagan talked about. The object is to have a national defense so strong that you discourage people from attacking you, you deter attack, but also that you can repel attack when necessary. I think we did the right thing after 9/11 by going into Afghanistan and saying, no more, we're not going to have this happen to us again. But I think sometimes when we've gotten involved in the Middle East, it has ended badly and made things worse. I think Hillary's war in Libya is a disaster. Libya is more dangerous now. You got chaos after Gaddafi was gone. You got the rise of radical Islam. And now you have a third of Libya pledging allegiance to ISIS. I think ISIS is a problem. But I think ISIS became stronger as weapons were going in supporting them and their allies against Assad. So there are times when intervention has unintended consequences. And I would argue in Libya, intervention made us less safe. Syria, initially less safe. But even going back to Iraq, I think toppling Hussein made Iran stronger, made Iran more of a menace to us. So we need to think before we act. And in medicine, we call it first do no harm. And I think there needs to be more of that in our foreign policy.
Senator, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, Senator Paul will not be the only Republican in the race. In fact, that field seems to be getting bigger by the day. One other candidate still considering is Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. Governor, this is an interesting time, particularly here in Michigan. As you know, at least one other fellow Republican has recently announced that they're going to be getting into the race. Ben Carson announced in Detroit. Rand Paul has also been in the state. You are here, and I know you're still working on that overall, exactly what you're going to do. Tell me about this process of considering a race for President of the United States, because it involves a lot of moving pieces.
It really does. And, you know, for starters, Republicans are blessed to have many great choices. I think it's a reflection of people not just being frustrated the past 6 years, but feeling a sense of optimism that with the right leadership, with a new Senate majority and a House majority, that with the right leader we can make this country great again. And for me, it's really as simple as going around the country. I've been here to Michigan a couple times already this year, obviously places like Iowa and New Hampshire, South Carolina as well, but it's really talking with folks. And what I found repeatedly is people want someone who can fight and win for everyday Americans like them. A lot of would-be candidates do a good job of fighting in Washington but haven't won a lot of battles. Some other folks have won elections but haven't taken on big fights. What makes us interested, at least in looking at this, is we've done both. We've fought and one for everyday hardworking taxpayers.
Well, for example, you had to run at least one extra time for your office in governor after the recall, and you were the only person to be able to beat that, is my
right. The only governor elected twice in the same term in American history.
And when you
not that I wish it on anybody, but
sure not. But when you look at that, that gives you a pretty good insight into just how difficult this could be, because this is real bare knuckles politics. And by the way, some of those folks who were not too happy about your union stance in Wisconsin will be all over this country.
Absolutely. I mean, I was the #1 target not only in 2012 in the recall. Last year, I was the #1 target in America in the House and the Senate governor's races. And between me, the race here in Michigan, the race in Florida, nationally, the union spent some $300 million they transferred from federal accounts to state accounts just to go after us because they wanted to take us out. Now, each of the three of us won, I think because in the end, in battleground states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, and others across the country, they want leaders. They want people who stand up and tell people what they're going to do and then go out and do that. And yeah, sure, we'll face some pressure, but you know, in all that happened in that recall election, we now have some 300,000 donors in all 50 states. In a weird sort of way, you know, the old adage, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is really true here. And most of those donors are people who gave us $75 or less, so a lot of grassroots support.
I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but I'm always interested in this as an observer, and it kind of is playing out again, the number of people here in the state of Michigan. How important does it become to win a state that, first of all, hasn't voted for a Republican in a general election since George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988? But how important does it become? I know all states are important, but when you look at that upper Midwest tier.
Well, for me, I think the pathway to a Republican president goes to the Midwest. So part of the reason I've been here a couple times already this year is if I'm going to get in, I think it's important both in March next year when there's a primary, because even though everybody talks about the early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada, not too long after that, and I think with a good competitive field, this is going to be drawn out for some time, at least well into March. Suddenly Michigan, with a lot of delegates, becomes critically important. Secondarily, along with that, I think the pathway to the president, the eventual nominee for the Republican Party, has got to do well in the Midwest. It means Iowa, it means Wisconsin, it means Michigan, it means Ohio. I'd even include Pennsylvania just because they're in the Big Ten, but I think that's a winnable state as much as Ohio and Michigan are. And I think there's a good message. It's kind of a Midwestern, blue-collar, working hard message about helping more people live the American dream that does well not only with Republicans, but I think a lot of independents in this state.
Talk about who you are in terms of what you have done as governor. What makes you think that that experience is transferable?
Well, I think it's a combination of both personal experiences. I mean, I started out as a kid. My parents, my dad was a preacher. My mom was a part-time secretary. To pay for school, I had to wash dishes at the Countryside restaurant and then work my way up to flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. My grandparents were farmers on one side of the family where they didn't have indoor plumbing until my mother went off to junior high school. My dad's dad was a machinist for 42 years. So I didn't inherit fame or fortune. What I got was the belief if you work hard and you play by the rules, you can do and be anything you want in America. And I think that's what people want, is someone who's going to fight for that dream, the American dream out there. What we've done in Wisconsin is we took on the big, powerful special interests in government, transferred the power from their hands to the hands of the hardworking taxpayers. We took on the big union bosses in terms of the public sector and got our budget from a $3.6 billion hole to surpluses in each of the last 4 years. We cut taxes by $2 billion. In fact, property taxes today are lower today than they were 4 years ago when we started. Our schools are better because of our reforms. We can hire and fire based on merit. We can pay based on performance. Our graduation rates are up. Our third grade reading scores are up. Our ACT scores are now second best in the country. Our pension's the only one fully funded in the country. We've done all the things you would want. And when it comes to the economy, when I was running as a candidate, January of 2010, the unemployment rate in our state was 9.2%. As of this past March, it was down to 4.6%, with more than 2/3 of our people working in the state. So we've had a complete comeback in Wisconsin. We're heading the right direction. We need that kind of change in our nation's capital.
You were recently in Grand Rapids for the Gerald R. Ford Boy Scout event, actually the Eagle Scout event, and we talked briefly, and you talked about your experience in scouting. You talked about how people like Gerald Ford kind of motivated you to get into politics, but you also talked about what you thought was the biggest issue facing the country. You had some real concern about the security of the United States and about the security, I take it, in a larger vein, not just around the United States, but those outside forces that would seek to do harm.
Well, I think we've seen, even in the last few days, sadly, some more examples of how it's not just limited to the Middle East with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other forms of radical Islamic terrorism. We've seen it in France, in Belgium, and Canada. We even see what at least appears to be, we don't know all the facts of what happened down in Texas, but real concerns that it's not a question of if an attempt is made on American soil, it's when another attempt in full force occurs here. And on behalf of my children and all the others across America, I'd rather take the fight to them than wait till they take the fight to us. I think that's something that this president and people like Hillary Clinton, who advised him for 4 years, have really let Americans down on. We used to be a force in the world. Doesn't mean we should be the cowboy that gets involved in everything, but I think where our interests are at stake, we need strong American leadership again.
Answer this if you can for me, and this is a bit of an unfair question because I can think back over the past several presidential cycles and think of a number of them, but you are a governor of an upper Midwestern state. You don't necessarily have experience as commander-in-chief or international foreign relations experience. What do you have that transfers to that? I mean, obviously there are more people that are around you than just yourself. But
well, a couple different things. One, just to put in perspective, I say in my lifetime, the best president of national security was a governor from California. In my lifetime, the worst president when it comes to national security was a freshman senator from Illinois. And so that doesn't mean that every senator is bad and every governor is great, but I think what it does say that leadership is really the most important thing when it comes to strong foreign policy and national security. And the reason why I liked Reagan, who was a governor, wasn't just because he was a governor, because Jimmy Carter was a governor too, and I didn't think he did a very good job. It was because of the clear vision he had, the strength that he exhibited, both here in America and around the world, the fact that he was willing to invest in our military, not because he wanted to use it. In fact, during Reagan's 8 years, it was one of the lowest levels of military engagement in our lifetime. It wasn't because he was afraid to use that show of force, it was because others knew he could, and he would if needed be. And so peace through strength is really what I abide by. As a governor, we're commander-in-chief of our National Guard, but more importantly, we pick a captain. We have to rely on people to be smarter than we are in given topics. Listen to that, draw that information in, sometimes play one cabinet member off of the other, but in the end, you got to make a decision. Members of Congress, a lot of good, decent people think about running for president, but giving speeches and attending committee meetings is not the same as actually being the one who has to, ultimately, the buck stops with them.
those are the first two of what will be dozens of interviews that we'll be doing for Decision 2016. Republicans alone could have as many as 20 or more candidates. We're back with more To the Point in just a minute. Welcome back to the Point. We recently had an opportunity to sit down with Congressman Dan Kildee. He's a Democrat from the east side of the state working on two international issues with very local ties. Congressman, let's begin by talking about something that I know that you're very interested in, and I did not know until we talked earlier that there is actually a precedent for this that was set when the United States wanted to do something similar. But let's start with our neighbor to the north, Canada, a generally very friendly, big trading partner, but they have decided, or at least they're in the process of deciding, that they would like to dispose of their nuclear waste someplace very near to one of our shared waterways.
That's right. In Kincardine, Ontario, just across the lake from my district, there is a proposed nuclear waste storage facility, a deep geological repository, which would be 0.6 of a mile from the water of Lake Huron. My view is that despite some of the assurances that we've received, and they've been pretty robust in their assurances, nothing can prevent human error. We saw this in New Mexico a couple of months ago when there was a release of nuclear material. If we can minimize the risk to our lakes, we should do so. It should be a bright red line when it comes to the Great Lakes. And our only ask is not that they do anything other than to look at other potential sites. And so I have a resolution, bipartisan resolution, that I introduced in Congress that would ask the Canadian government and the American government to pursue the location of this nuclear waste storage facility someplace other than in a shared water source, as the Canadian government did 30 years ago when the U.S. was considering a similar repository in Maine in a shared water basin 24 miles away from a shared water basin. If 24 miles is too close for the Canadians, 0.6 of a mile is too close for us.
There's somebody sitting out there listening right now saying, wait a minute, this is crazy. This is the largest supply of fresh water in North America. We have done everything we can over the years to try to preserve it to some degree for us to try to keep others from trying to siphon it out.
Right.
all of those kind of things, and now an idea of putting nuclear waste, no matter how safely it is stored, in the minds of people, it still sounds dangerous. Why do you believe, or do you know, why the Canadians have picked this spot?
Well, they haven't looked at any other site, for one thing, which is a source of some frustration because it's a vast resource. The land resource of Canada is huge. They have 10% of our population. They could look somewhere else. I don't think they looked, and this is only my conjecture, but because that community, Kincardine, has long hosted a nuclear generator, they've already accepted nuclear power as a part of the landscape of their community. And so for the Canadian government, for the Ontario Power Generation Company, to look elsewhere would have meant taking on the tall task of trying to persuade a different community to accept nuclear waste as a part of their landscape. And I think they made, my judgment anyway, is that they made the calculation that let's just go ahead and put it where this community has already accepted it. Now, it might be fine for the people of Kincardine, but they don't live in a vacuum. They live on the shore of the greatest freshwater source in the country. So they can't just decide for themselves that they're willing to take that risk, not when we accept the risk as a result of that decision.
I know very often we hear about governors of Great Lakes states and representatives from Canada's government sitting down together to talk about how we're jointly going to use that shared water, those waterways. What ability, if any, do we have to try to gently suggest beyond, obviously a congressional resolution says a lot, but it's still a resolution. It doesn't have a binding impact. Do we have any ability to exert pressure? And again, when I say pressure, that sounds a little odd because Canada is a big trading partner. It's not like we want to get in some kind of an argument with them.
Well, they're a partner, they're a trading partner, they're also friends. And you know, it continues to be a friendly relationship. This is just one point where I think we may disagree with some in Canada. We can have some influence, and it's mostly just the influence of public opinion. What we have found is that this is not a partisan question. Democrats and Republicans have joined in my resolution. I have 9 Republicans and 10 Democrats. It's not a Canada-US question because there are as many opponents in Canada to this decision as there are in the United States. I've been working with a member of Parliament, Brian Massey from Windsor, who's joined me in organizing opposition. The city of Ontario, of Toronto, Ontario, has passed a resolution asking for a different location. So it's the loud voices of people across the political spectrum and across both borders that I think will make the difference in the end of the day. We hope that it makes sense to them to at least pursue another option.
And depending on what we do with our energy policy over the course of the next few decades, we may have to answer this question again and again, but that's not a question for us to decide here.
Right.
I want to move on to something else that does deal, at least in some degree, with nuclear power, and some would suggest nuclear weapons, and that's the conversation that this administration, President Obama and Secretary Kerry, have been having with the Iranian government. You can categorize that however you want to as we get in this discussion. But this is a particularly acute conversation for you because one American citizen, U.S. Marine from your district, is being held by the Iranians. And I know you have said in the past that you want to make sure that as those conversations go on, that the disposition of this American citizen is on the forefront.
Right. Now, we never want to connect the outcome of the nuclear negotiations, which I support. I think it's the right thing to do, to negotiate with our potential dangerous partners in the globe rather than fight this out on the battlefield. But I don't think we ever want to make as a condition of a concession in nuclear negotiations the freedom of an innocent man. But as you said, we're trying to make sure that Iran understands that it would be impossible for the American people, and for speaking for myself, an American member of Congress, to view the negotiations with Iran over their nuclear capabilities and ignore the fact that they stand outside the global community by holding political prisoners who have done nothing other than, in case of Amir Hekmati, serve in the U.S. military. He was born in the United States, and when he traveled to Iran, they treated him as an Iranian citizen and charged him with cooperating with a hostile government. I mean, the logic is not something that we could understand here in this country, but setting that aside, how can we look at Iran as a true participant in global affairs if they hold political prisoners. And we just want to make sure they understand that.
Isn't that part of the larger problem? I mean, our complex relationship with Iran, where in some areas of the Middle East, we are fighting a common enemy, and in other places in the Middle East, they are believed to be trying to arm what we believe are enemies. At once, we want to negotiate to talk about how they're going to use their nuclear power, and on the other hand, they're holding American citizens. That seems like a very complex way to negotiate.
It is, and it kind of speaks to the complexities of global affairs right now, especially in the Middle East, but it also affects the relationship with Russia, for example. It used to be said that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy, I don't know what that is, but we know with Iran, we need not to trust them, but this deal allows us to verify whether or not they're complying with these agreements. So the complicated web of relationships is one that's hard to untangle. And so I think if we keep our eye focused on this singular question of their nuclear capability, whatever their current or future entanglements might be, it will be far less volatile if we can ensure that the breakout time associated with them weaponizing nuclear material is long enough for us to act.
Our thanks to Congressman Kildee, and we're back with a note about next week's show in a moment. The dust continues to settle on Proposal 1. Next week, we will devote our entire show, see you Sunday, to the point.